Let's now look at human food and agriculture, the way humans produce their food through agricultural techniques, and how that system, which is global, has some problems related to the environment and distribution. Good news is our global food production here, represented by global cereal production, has been increasing, getting ahead of the population. It's been increasing at a rate faster than the population rate for the last 50 to 60 years. The only problem is the distribution of that overabundance, really, of food, shown here by cereals, has not been equitable. It's not the food where it's produced in high amounts or overproduced is not getting distributed to the areas where it's needed the most. So there's still lots of pockets of malnourishment throughout the world. So it's food production and the ability to have greater and greater technological advances in agriculture that can increase production and crop yields isn't the whole problem. It's also our distribution system, our political systems that hinder the equitable distribution of those foods, and lots of other social factors too. So it's a bigger issue than just how much we grow. So even though we have global increases in food production, we still have almost a billion, that's 1/8 of the world's population, that are undernourished. They're not getting enough nutrients in general. So they might be having enough food volume or too much food volume, but they're not getting the appropriate nutrients in that. For example, maybe people that just eat a lot of rice or corn. Some underdeveloped countries are like that, getting a lot of starches but not enough protein or not enough of the essential micronutrients too. Some of the effects of that undernourishment or malnourishment can be just muscle strength loss, exhaustion, tiredness, inability to take care of oneself from that exhaustion, even mood disorders, and then other serious diseases that can come from long-term undernourishment or malnourishment. In places like the United States, considered a developed country, we tend to think of the top two pictures as something that's representative of malnourishment or undernourishment. And the bottom one, not so much related to that, but overabundance of food too is also a form of malnourishment. Ingesting too much food, more than the body can handle, and that can cause imbalances too. Famines are something that can happen, which is related to malnourishment, but it's usually a widespread kind of almost like an event where there's a number of factors: war, natural disaster, crop failure, or something that kind of causes a catastrophic inability for a large group of people to not get the food or nutrients they need. That can often be because of government policies or politics, as in war, or economic problems. But it can also be related to crop diseases that can sweep through a particular monoculture of crops and wipe it out, really depleting the food source for a lot of people. It's a very dramatic and kind of heartbreaking thing to happen when we have famines, because we have large groups of people that aren't getting enough food or nutrients and they starve. There's this memorial for the famine that happened in 1845 to 1852 in Ireland that was created by mostly a fungal disease that affected the potato crop, and potatoes were a huge crop. Many thousands of acres in Ireland were devoted to this one particular crop, and even one variety of that crop, all wiped out by this one fungal pathogen which took over, and that caused widespread starvation and death. 1 million people starved to death during that time, and that was a very large portion of the population at the time and was catastrophic. On the other hand, we've got overeating as also a form of malnourishment. Wealthier countries, the number of overweight people vastly exceeds the number that are underweight compared to underdeveloped countries. Why is that? We've got a lot of food production and a lot of people eating more than they need to. Maybe they, for a number of reasons, it could be that the quality of the food is low, so they're eating a lot of flour and sugar and oils and not having protein, and that can lead to needing more carbs and sugars, these fast metabolized products, and that can lead to obesity. The body's storing more because it feels like it's under some kind of stress. That's a problem. And it's also a problem just for the health in general of the populace. Look at this graph kind of comparing United States to India. India is considered, it's almost, I think it's considered a developed country, but there's lots of portions of it that are considered underdeveloped, more agrarian, more rural, and those people there, you have a larger portion that are underweight than overweight. So you have, as opposed to the United States, where you have a lot of overweight compared to underweight. That is also a problem with food distribution and consumption. You might have heard the phrase food security or food deserts thrown around, and that just means that food security is you have access to the sufficient food to meet the dietary needs for yourself, to live a healthy life and stay healthy. A family is food secure when its members do not live in hunger or fear of hunger or fear of disease from lack of proper nutrients or even having the disease, not just fear of, but it's an ideal that I think globally humanity would like to see all people living in food security. Another reason why we have our global food crops like cereals the production of cereals has increased over the last 60 years or so, but we still have poverty and starvation, people not getting the right food, malnourishment, is that a lot of these crops are now going to be, they're used for animal feed, which is called fodder. Corn and soybeans, most that are grown are used for animal feed, not for human food. And then the animals, of course, people eat the animals or the animal products, so it eventually becomes human food, but a lot more energy has to go into people eating meat or animal byproducts like dairy than eating the plants themselves. So even though we have a large production of plant foods from agriculture, that increase doesn't always translate to getting to the humans that need it. A lot of corn and soybeans, but we'll start with corn, are grown not just for human food or for animal food, they're also used for industrial uses too. Corn is used to produce a biofuel, meaning a fuel that comes from plants, not fossil fuels, called ethanol. Ethanol is one, comes from corn, sorghum, or barley is the most common biofuel. Butanol is another one that comes from corn. Biodiesel comes from vegetable oils, yellow grease, used cooking oils like French fries, or animal fats. So some cars, now we have a lot of electric cars online, but maybe about 15 years ago, some people were converting their automobile to use biodiesel. And I know I had a friend that changed his motor over from, it was a Mercedes, and he did it himself so that it could take biofuel, or biodiesel, excuse me, used vegetable oils, cooking oils, and turn that into a power source for his Mercedes. And when he would sometimes get those used oils from different restaurants, and so when he drove in his car, it smelled like French fries. It's kind of fun. But those are other uses of these crops. So like the cartoon shows, like some of these things that could be human foods are going towards other things, arguably less important, but People do these, grow these crops to make biofuels because they can make money at it. There's a market. So there's some complexity to it. Another indirectly related topic is just meat consumption. As I mentioned earlier, it's a lot more energy intensive to produce meat for people to eat than it is to produce plants for people to eat. Where is meat consumption the highest and the lowest in the world is shown by this graph in general. The upper left is showing you that meat consumption globally has increased over time. The lower right is showing you that in general, meat consumption is high in the developed world, where there's a lot more money and resources. So the wealthier eat more meat, which, because of its energy consumptiveness and its reliance, the meat production system, its reliance on fossil fuels, you can kind of deduce that countries that are more developed are the ones that have a big share in the responsibility of contributing to climate change, more CO2 in the atmosphere, which comes from combustion of fossil fuels. Let's talk for a moment, lastly in this section of the lecture, about confined animal feeding operations. Those are ones that produce agricultural meat, dairy, or eggs, where animals are kept and raised in confinement. So they're not free-range grazing animals, kind of like they are genetically meant to be ranging and migrating around to where there's food. This is where they're kept in confined areas and given food and given usually some antibiotics and things, and often even given things to keep them calm because they're stressed being so compacted. And that's where a lot of our meat and dairy and eggs come from, those situations. It's high yield per square foot. They can get, these farmers can get a lot of yield out of it, but there's a cost to that. The negatives involve higher disease incidence among those organisms. Inhumane conditions, these animals are not genetically adapted and developed to live in these situations, so it's stressful for them. They're given so many antibiotics to reduce infections and disease that spread easily because they're so dense. There's so many in a small area that they develop antibiotic resistance. And all the waste from those areas is very concentrated and is a problem too. It can be like from these dairy farms. Sometimes they're near waterways or lakes or rivers, and when there's rain, a lot of this can get washed into the water systems and cause overabundance of nutrients, which disrupts the natural aquatic system too. So there's problems with that. Read here about the tragedy of the commons. In general, the idea came from, the name came from a paper written by Garrett Hardin in Science Magazine, a publication in 1968, but it referred to the use of common areas that were near a city or nearby, like in the Boston Commons or like Central Park, that used to be just a big open agricultural area near the city. But how it started is there's so many different parties or families or farms using this same common area that no one really was in charge of or owned, led to a few families overusing that common area and having that area become degraded and no longer useful as pasture. So that's the tragedy. When no one's in charge and you have multiple parties using it, each individual party tends to get more selfish and get as much as they can and not worry about the degradation of the habitat because no one's thinking about that. They're all just kind of doing a quick grab for what they can, and that can lead to the problems of the tragedy of that pasture land becoming overgrazed and collapsing and no longer being able to be grazed anymore. And that happened in the 1630s through 40s in Boston with the Boston Commons. So the Boston Commons was an example of a pasture land commons which went bad because of the concept of the tragedy of multiple ownerships and no one in charge, and you get poor stewardship. But fisheries are a much more recently understood to be a commons too. We all use them. There's no real lines and boundaries in different fisheries, meaning areas where fish are caught and used from. The fisheries are a type of commons, and we also are learning to not just have everyone do whatever they want and take as much as they can. We've, over the last 30, 40 years, there have been restrictions put on how much fish you can take. There's oversight and policing of those rules, and it has led to bouncing back of some collapsed fisheries, meaning fish levels going to almost so low that they can't be fished anymore. And we've seen rebounding of some fish species. Here, this slide says global fish consumption increased at an average annual rate of 3.1 from basically the last 60 years. So people are eating a lot more fish, and there's a lot more people too. So that puts a lot more pressure on that commons of marine fisheries, and we need more management and guidelines and restrictions on that so we don't get a collapse of the fisheries again. One of the reasons we've seen fisheries collapse is partly related to just the levels of phytoplankton. So phytoplankton, the levels of it in the ocean have gone down constantly over the last 75 years. That means the plankton is declined almost 40% in that time period, or almost 50. Less plankton, which is the bottom of the food chain, means less food for fish, so we have less fish and less to catch, and more quickly could we cause a collapse in that fisheries. The populations of those fish get so low that they go away in that area. That can more readily happen with our with this other factor of lowering amounts of plankton in the ocean. And as I briefly mentioned in the past, Japanese fishers used a lot of dynamite to do fishing in Indonesia in the 1970s, and that led to a lot of fisheries collapse and reef destruction in that time period in Indonesia. So one of the solutions to overuse of fisheries are sustainable systems where fish are farmed, or seaweed is farmed, or mussels are farmed. This is just 3 examples of sustainably farmed fisheries. Farmed shellfish like oysters, mussels, and scallops, and seaweed are some of the most sustainable aquacultural systems and food options, especially when you think about fish. Well, all of these really, but when we have to create a crop, say grow corn, we've got to take off all the natural vegetation and plant a whole new crop. So we destroy an ecosystem and then put our crop in, and we've got to usually do some additives of fertilizers, sometimes water too. But in a fishery, all you have to do is have a protected area within the ocean, like this netted area within the natural ecosystem of the ocean, and all the nutrients and the water and oxygen, everything is provided for those fish. So there's no habitat destruction, there's no inputs, it's just mostly protection and maybe some disease reduction in those already naturally situated fisheries. So these are really good foods to eat for sustainability. Fish, as far as how it's produced, is much more sustainable than eating anything that's raised on land, meat, or plants. So we've touched on some of the main ecosystems that our food systems are based upon. We talked a little bit about agricultural systems, crops, also about marine fisheries. But let's go back to the soil aspect of those crop systems and think about or question whether the soil is a renewable resource. So all the plants, when they grow, they absorb nutrients out of the soil and water, and then those nutrients are no longer in the soil, especially if that crop is harvested and taken away. So what we're looking at is, or the question is, can we sustain that soil health and the levels of nutrients in the soils, maintain them as we grow our foods and our crops? Yes is the answer. It's possible. Soil can be
a sustainable and renewable resource if cared for properly. The proper amounts of nutrients and microbes and keeping that moisture level correct for all the microbes that are inherent and in a really healthy soil will keep it renewing itself. It keeps the organic matter breaking down, enriching and adding nutrients as some are absorbed into the plants, some remains in the soil. So it can be done. We can have soil be a renewable resource. Have we done that with Maine industrial agriculture? Not at all. We've used it, and many places the soil's richness has been used up, the nutrient levels have gone down, the soil system collapses, and then that area of land is discarded. It's no longer useful, so we move on to another area. But a renewable soil system is one that keeps sustaining itself, or as time goes by, gets healthier, gets more nutrients and more fertility. The 5 main ingredients in a healthy soil would be organic matter. It's the dead material that came from living things like leaves, sticks, roots that are no longer part of those organisms or the plants. So organic matter, soil microbes, that includes mainly fungi and bacteria that are soil dwelling, plant roots, and then also water and minerals and air. Maybe that's 6. If you take out plant roots, it's 5. But 6 if you include things that aren't the microbes that are also in the soil, that are using the soil. So there's a lot that's going on in there that's part of that soil system. The layers of a soil are broken up into the organic layer, or the O horizon. It's called a horizon instead of a layer just because it's a horizontal layer. The O horizon is made up of just partially decomposed plant and animal material. So if you're looking at the soil, looking down, you would see the O horizon on top, and it's kind of sticks and leaves, and there's things you can kind of recognize. It's not completely decomposed, so the chunks are bigger. Underneath that is what's called the topsoil, and that is where the organic matter, like the leaves and sticks, etc., dead bugs, they have been decomposed to a level of you can no longer distinguish the parts where they came from. It just looks like dark, rich soil. Ideally, that's kind of typical. Below the A horizon, or A horizon is also known as the topsoil, is the B horizon, the subsoil. There's not a lot of air, water, or microbes. There's some roots, but usually just bigger tap roots, and it's usually lighter in color because there's less organic matter. The organic matter is what gives the topsoil its dark color, and it's more kind of a place where tap roots and things would grow into that for stability of the plant, not for gathering nutrients and water. That's done more in the topsoil in general. Soil biology is what makes soil fertility. So the more diverse set of microbes in the soil, think mostly bacteria and fungi that are in the soil, and they are growing and dying. Like bacteria only live for a few days, fungi longer, for a few months, but they're constantly growing, and then they die, and then they leave those nutrients in the soil. And what living organisms do is accumulate elements and resources. So one bacterium in the soil takes in a lot of nutrients and uses them to build its body, and then those nutrients are in higher concentration there, and when that bacterium dies, now there's a little pocket of relatively high nutrients for the roots of the plants to access. So they're condensing and concentrating nutrients that are all over the place in an elemental form in the soil, and bringing them in and concentrating them and building that soil up and making it better in that way. The bigger the soil organism, the more concentration of nutrients, and when that organism dies, the more release of those nutrients in that little area. So soil biology, those organisms are directly increasing the soil fertility. Here's a dramatic picture of almost a dramatization, really, of conventional agriculture and its kind of negatives, excessiveness of huge areas, thousands of acres of one crop, often one variety of one type of crop, massively planted, grown, produced, fertilized, protected with pesticides, massively harvested with large machinery. This is very intensive as far as fossil fuel and energy production, and in production of the vehicles themselves, not just fueling them. But a monoculture is when one single crop is planted over a wide area, like you're seeing here. Just one plant, monoculture. And the positives of that is you get a lot of that particular food produced in an area. The negatives are all the intensive energy sources that go into that, and then also the vulnerability of that system to pest or even drought or storms. Like if something is going to damage and weaken that particular crop, it's going to do it on a wide scale now. So that's what a monoculture is, and kind of the pros and cons of it. This one doesn't really have any question in the study guide questions that's directly related to this, but it is pretty interesting. I already talked about the monoculture being a single crop planted over a wide area, and monocultures are the vast majority of the way food is produced in North America and many other places in the world. In contrast, a polyculture would be a number or a multitude of different crops grown in the same spot. So you've got, maybe if you think of that corn picture we just looked at, think of trees in there and maybe shrubs and some vines all in the same plot. So you have now multiple crops. It's a polyculture, many in the same place. And this is comparing the two. You might get in the monoculture in grains 5 tons of grain per hectare. Could be wheat, could be sorghum, barley, corn, soybeans. And then if you have right next to it 0.6 of a hectare fruit trees, and out of that you got 15 tons of fruit per hectare. The same area, similar area in a polyculture, having those mixed, you can actually get a very similar amount of food. So these numbers here are for 1 hectare, but if you multiplied it by 1.4, you'd be actually getting more. So it's different, obviously, well, maybe not obviously, but the harvesting of those products is simpler in a monoculture. You can have one machine, one method for the whole area. In a polyculture, you've kind of got to go in there and hand pick, not always by hand, but much more carefully take out the different crops that are in that polyculture. So there's more labor involved. But as far as sustaining the system, the polyculture is much better as an ecosystem, healthier. You'll have a more diverse soil food web when you have a more diverse above ground crop or vegetation system, and you can get a similar production without the amount of soil depletion. With lots of crops, what happens, especially in a monoculture, even their trees or grains or whatever they are in that crop, the system has been simplified so much to just support that one crop that that they use a lot of tractors, and which constantly till the soil to get rid of weeds, and for planting and for preparing for the next crop, that it leaves the soil very exposed. There's big portions of the crop fields and portions of the year, certain seasons, when those fields are just bare dirt, and that's when they're very vulnerable to erosion, and you get loss of topsoil, you get desertification, meaning the landscape's been damaged by overgrazing or overplanting, and all the plants either die if they've been grazed down to nothing, or the plants have been killed because in a crop field they've been taken out and then there's just nothing left. And then the soil is really vulnerable. If you have rain or high winds, it erodes and it washes away, and some of those sediments can go into nearby waterways and cause a lot of problems by causing way too much sedimentation into the rivers, which clogs the oxygen levels for the aquatic animals, and then the plants get covered over too. But that whole process of soil being the plants dying out, the soil microbes being depleted and dying, and then the soil starting to erode is called desertification. Taking a healthy soil system and plant system above it, and it becomes a desert because the soils die out and wash away, and the plants all die too. And if the soil becomes desertified, either through, we talked about just last slide, through overgrazing or monoculture, and upper right picture, crops being harvested and then tilled, getting ready for the next crop, and they get dry, and they've already been depleted of nutrients because the soil system of microbes is pretty weak at that point. They can be prone to erosion, and from wind here you're just seeing huge windstorms that can happen from that. And that is part of the problem we had during the Dust Bowl years in the United States in the South and Southwest. Is this a efficient way to irrigate crops in areas that are somewhat arid, spraying during the day over the crops? In a way, I mean, from the farmer's point of view, they're trying to reduce costs and increase yields. So these look like little lettuces or something like that. They're trying to keep them moist and growing during a hot day. It's probably in the United States Southwest. So it's important to do that. As far as water conservation, it's a very inefficient way because a lot of that water is being lost to evaporation. Not a lot of it is getting into the soil and helping the soil biology. But these plants are not, the way they're being grown is not really considering the soil biology. This is almost like growing plants in gravel on concrete. As long as you keep them wet, they'll stay alive till they get big enough to sell. Another thing about this too is a lot of irrigation. So there's over irrigation because they have to account for the losses from evaporation, but also fertilizers are added to these plants too to help them grow. But when this happens over and over, the salts left over from the fertilizers accumulate in the top of the soil. Then farmers have to over irrigate to wash those salts down so they're out of the root zone to keep the plants growing, because the plant roots don't like too many salts from years of adding fertilizers. So then you get more water use, and then slowly you're contaminating a deeper column of soil with salts. And then when that's all done, basically that salinized crop field is just a wasteland. Nothing can grow there. It has to be abandoned, and the farmers have to move on to a new area. So that's what that means by like a salinized soil. And those are some of the causes of it. We don't really have any great solutions to it at this point. So let's talk about fertilizer application. That's probably what's happening here. Could be pesticides, but I don't think so. I think this is a fertilizer application, which is occasional. It's not all the time. So this is definitely not just irrigating those strawberries. I think they're strawberries. So as fertilizers are added, the types of fertilizers that are given to plants are usually nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium are the three big ones. The forms of nitrogen that a plant's root can absorb are nitrate, NO3, and ammonium, NH4. So those are the two that a plant can uptake from the soil, and those are the ones that are added. And again, like the last slide, to tie it into that, these can be over added, and they're usually added to the soil, and they are often in salt form, so sometimes they can build up in the soil and cause salinization. But these are the two that are the most important for plants to absorb. In a healthy soil ecosystem, you would have organic matter being broken down by microbes, which would release the nitrate and ammonium into the soil for plants to take. It wouldn't have to be added on chemically and artificially like you're seeing here. This is done probably because these crop fields have been used too much and they're depleted in those nutrients, and they don't have healthy soil biology, so humans have to add them chemically to make those crops grow. This is similar to what I was describing in just talking about in the last slide, the forms of nitrogen related to the crops and how we grow them, but how that can get into the waterways and cause eutrophication. And I think this must be a British slide. It says eutrophication. This is restating some of the stuff in the last slide, showing you how some of the overabundance of nitrogen compounds that humans put on crops, etc., and fertilizers, and how that can get into aquatic systems and cause eutrophication, the overabundance of nitrogen in the water, which causes an overabundance of algae and aquatic plants, which can cause a lack of water oxygenation and problems for things like fish that need dissolved oxygen in the water and they can't get it. So it causes problems with aquatic environments and ecosystems and the biodiversity in that area. I think this is this is a slide of European origin. So they say eutrophization, and eutrophication is what we say here in the States. So what are 4 ways that industrial agriculture depends on oil? Well, one of them is all the machinery is fueled by fossil fuels, which comes from oil. 2, the fertilizers are often made from fossil fuels. 3, pesticides are made from fossil fuels. And 4, irrigation has to be moved from one place to another through irrigation canals, pumps, etc. Energy has to be used to move water around, and that is often energy is used from fossil fuels as well. So it's a fossil fuel intensive way to produce food. Why are pesticides used in agriculture? Well, to kill pests. The pests eat the plants, cause disease, cause weakness in the plant, indirectly or directly reduce yields or production of those crops. But they don't have to be used as much as they are used if you have a more sustainable type of agriculture. So they're heavily used these days in industrial agriculture because we mostly rely on monocultural farming, which creates a very weak ecosystem, all one variety of a crop in a large area. Pests can easily proliferate. If they like that crop, they can just take over the whole area because it's all the same plant. Usually the soil system is depleted, which also stresses the plant, which makes them more vulnerable to infection. Those are the reasons that we overuse pesticides. And in general, like we'll take example, strawberries produced in the area here in the South Coast around Santa Barbara or even up to Santa Maria. The strawberries are so prone to fungal infection and soil pathogens that usually the farmers sterilize the soil almost completely. They used to use methyl bromide, which was found to have a lot of negative effects, toxic effects for humans. Now they use another thing called methyl iodide, which is not thought to be as bad. But it's like a fumigant where the soil is sterilized so there's no living things in the soil. That's overdosing really the soil on a pesticide, which kills a lot of good stuff in the soil too. But that's why we use a lot of the pesticides. If we have a polycultural system that's based more on the soil health, the soil microbial health, and a polycultural crop system, or livestock like chickens or dairy cattle that are not in confined spaces, those systems are stronger and they don't need as many pesticides or fertilizers. It's kind of like humans. Like if you eat all the right stuff, get rest, you take care of yourself, you stay balanced between mental and physical needs, you're stronger and you resist a lot more diseases that way. That's what a healthy soil and agro ecosystem is. It's strong inherently, and it doesn't need as many outside inputs or remedies to fix it. Organophosphate-based insecticides are often used in industrial agriculture, kind of like I talked to you about on the things used in sterilizing the soil for strawberry crops. It's just one example, and that does well to kill many pathogens and pests, but they have a negative effect in animals. In humans, the compounds inhibit the enzyme acetylcholinesterase, which is responsible for the degradation of acetylcholine, which is a neurotransmitter. So it kind of like acetylcholine lets your nerves transmit the pulse. It's a stimulant to a nerve ending. So it's when you have a buildup of acetylcholine because the organophosphate is inhibiting its breakdown, then you get constant stimulation of that nerve, too much, and it leads to neurological disorders. Glyphosate is the active ingredient in Roundup, a very effective broadleaf herbicide or weed killer that's used in many crops, in monocultures for sure, but also in landscapes too. Humans that are repeatedly exposed and use or apply Roundup are exposed to glyphosate too much, and they form respiratory problems. Lungs and nose, asthma, and even more serious effects can occur. And more recently, like last 10 years, some of the other ingredients in Roundup, not just the glyphosate, but the other inert, supposedly, the ingredients that don't relate to weed killing. Glyphosate interrupts cell division in the weeds, so it stops the growth. But the other ones have been shown to be probable carcinogens. So there's a lot of problems with Roundup. And more bad stuff. Chlorinated hydrocarbons are also something that's used to kill pests in crops, especially in industrialized agriculture where you get big outbreaks of pests because we have big volumes of the same crop in the monocultures. They can accumulate in the environment. So some of them, it's like a DDT is an old-fashioned one that's not used anymore, but they are very persistent. They're sprayed on crops, they kill the pests, but some of the residues stay in the soil and they don't go away. They are organochlorine-based compounds. They can build up. They can cause reproductive failure in birds. So there's a big negative effect for wildlife. It's not so good for humans either. That's an example of a chlorinated hydrocarbon pesticide that was used. And then we have atrazine, another synthetic pesticide that's used. It's an herbicide, actually, to control broadleaf, just like Roundup, broadleaf weeds and grasses too, though. Roundup can't affect grasses, but just broadleaf weeds, but atrazine can do both. And it's still used. It's sprayed on row crops like corn, sugarcane, etc., sometimes on residential lawns. Been used on highway rights-of-way to keep the weeds down and spaces open there. So it's effective in that sense, but it's also really harsh on wildlife. It's been shown to induce complete feminization and chemical castration in male frogs, some male frogs, so really big effects on reproduction in wildlife. And it's been also added to California's list of known cancer-causing compounds or reproductive harm for humans as well. This is not a good chemical. It's not worth killing all our weeds for this negative effect. Two well-known pesticide fumigants, methyl bromide or arsenic, have been used on crops to kill the pests, but they also have negative effects for humans and other animals. They're toxic, and they also, methyl bromide itself damages the ozone layer too, and has been shown to be very toxic for humans as well. So some of them are still being used, and they're not good. They have negative environmental effects and human health effects that we need to be aware of. This is just to help you kind of picture how those pesticides can affect other organisms. washing off the plants into the soil. The soil can get in, some of the residues from runoff can get into the waterways, and that can, the soils and the crops and the organisms that are in those systems, like the land system and the waterways, can get into humans and cause human health effects. Mention some birds that eat these fish, or insects that have some of these chemicals in them. It can affect them. Think of that frog in this aquatic pond near the crop field. So it enters the system. These are open systems, so those chemicals can flow far and wide from their source and cause a lot of problems. Let's talk for a moment about the pesticide treadmill, which causes a lot of problems for ecological communities and human communities too. So let's start with the orange. Number one, industrial agriculture develops patented seeds, like the soybeans that Monsanto developed, that are resistant to Roundup. So you can grow those soybean crops. When the weeds start to grow, you can spray Roundup all over your field and it kills all the weeds, but not your soybean crop. So an example of the big ag, like Monsanto, develops patented seeds for use with specific pesticides. The sale of the seeds leads to increased use of pesticides. So you were selling the seeds and you got to reduce weeds, which reduce yields. The pesticide is used even more so, not worrying about how it hurts the crop, to get rid of the weeds to increase the production. Then that widespread use of that pesticide leads to some of those weeds are genetically different. In natural selection, in any population, if it's a weed or a human or a fish population, there's varieties, there's different individual genetics, and some of those weeds are able to handle the Roundup and don't get killed. Now the next generation of weeds comes from those weeds that were able to survive. They were naturally selected as better fit and better reproduction even with Roundup in the situation. So now you have super weeds that don't respond to spraying Roundup on them anymore, so that the farmer either has to add more Roundup or a whole new Roundup, a different chemical. So you're breeding, it's just like antibiotics with humans. By using so many of them, we actually speed up natural selection to produce germs or pathogens or pests that are resistant to these methods. And meanwhile, we are soaking our bodies with antibiotics or soaking our soils with pesticides. So we end up with a very damaged ecosystem and no solution to the pest or pathogen. The Green Revolution, which came about in the 40s and 50s, was an era where plant geneticists used traditional methods of crossbreeding plants, taking the pollen and putting it on the stigma, breeding plants to be stronger and have more desirable traits. It was not genetic modification that we do now, but they selected plants for larger, more nutritious fruits, like fruits meaning in the botanical sense. Rice was one of them, that really good producing rice that was even healthier and had more vitamins in it. That was produced or developed during the Green Revolution, and it was hoped that this was a method of reducing hunger throughout the world, to produce more and stronger and more nutritious foods for all humans. The positives were that it indeed increased food production worldwide. The Green Revolution also had negatives, though. It focused on industrializing agriculture and using more fossil fuels and fossil fuel-based pesticides, which caused more erosion and led to more soil health depletion, and sped up the process of eroding crop plant diversity too. So there were a lot of negatives to it. It ends up as actually having a big negative effect on agriculture. So let's take a moment and I will explain some of the background on what a genetically modified organism is. So before we had genetic engineering techniques, which lead to GMOs, we just had plant breeding. Breeders would take a plant that they really liked, maybe let's say a tomato plant that produced really big tomatoes, and and take the seeds of that and grow more of those. And when they grew up the seeds, then from that crop, they would take the seeds of the biggest tomatoes of all those that population, and then keep doing that until they get bigger and bigger tomatoes. It could have been also for shelf life. They lasted longer on the shelf, or they were more disease resistant. But breeding took natural sexual reproduction and growing up of the seeds and selection, sometimes crossbreeding, taking the pollen of one flower of a plant and putting it on the stigma of another one to try to get characteristics of both plants into one. But it took that breeding or sexual reproduction, and it was slower, but it was effective. And that's just an example with plants. There's also an example with animals too, that breeders have done this for, oh gosh, hundreds if not thousands of years, tried to breed two animals together that had traits that both had traits that were desired, to get those traits into one organism. So genetic engineering is when DNA from one organism is isolated and taken out of that organism. It's got its codes for some desirable trait and put into another organism. So let's look at corn as an example. There's a type of corn, it's been around a while now, at least a couple of decades, called BT corn. And BT is comes from a bacterium called Bacillus thuringiensis. It produces a toxin, this bacteria does, that naturally kills caterpillars. And caterpillars are a big pest on corn crops, some caterpillars. So they'll get into the crop field and they'll eat the corn, they'll eat the plant, and it causes a lot of damage. So what genetic engineers did is take the gene that codes for that protein, that toxin, out of the bacterium, and by using another bacterial intermediary, they got it to be inserted in some of the cells of the corn plant. Usually this whole thing is done at the cellular level. So you get DNA extracted from the bacteria, and then it's put into the intermediary bacterium. Bacteria have DNA that when you expose it to some other DNA, it'll absorb the other DNA, and then that can be put on the cells of the corn plant, and some of those cells will take in that genetic material, that DNA, and make it part of their own. So you end up with an organism that has the genetics for making that toxin, the BT, the Bacillus thuringiensis protein, and that is what can create this GMO. Now it has the genes to make that toxin, and so when those pests, the moth or caterpillar, caterpillar and butterfly populations, these pests get on the corn and they start eating the corn plants, they die because they contain a toxic substance to those caterpillars. If it was regular corn, not the BT corn, they could eat the corn plant, and those caterpillars would not die. So that's one example of a GMO. A positive effect of genetically modified organisms are we can get corn plants now that are resistant to caterpillars. And we can also increase the yields of some of our species. We can increase their resistance to drought, definitely from pests, and even some herbicides too. These are all positives. None of them are really falling under the category, though, of sustainable or regenerative agriculture. They're just enhanced scientific techniques to get rid of pests and deal with pests. Regenerative agriculture is based on a healthy soil system, diversity of crops, low amount of fossil fuels, reduction of pollution, things that are done so the agricultural system more mimics a natural ecosystem and helps that system regenerate as humans are getting food and products from it that they need, and the soil builds as that happens instead of having it deplete. Regenerative agriculture also shifts the paradigm from the industrial agricultural system, which competes with nature, disturbs the soil, has monocultures, keeps kind of thinking of everything as in compartments and reducing it down to small components, as opposed to regenerative agriculture or sustainable agriculture, which thinks in systems, thinks holistically, and focuses on the diversity of species, like as many as we can put into the agro ecosystem, and it protects and builds the soils, and we're collaborating with natural systems and processes rather than working against them. This slide kind of gives a nod to something we've already talked about, in the sense that we want to reduce our use of energy in general wherever we are using it to make our world more sustainable. And one place we're using more than we need to is in commercial or industrialized agriculture. Those 4 ways that fossil fuel is used in big ag. Also, reducing our consumption of meat. Meat takes a lot more energy than plants do to produce, and so plant-based diets would be much better for humans and the world's ecosystems than meat-based diets. I mean, my own opinion is a little bit of meat is good here and there, but not a lot and not all the time, like I think especially United States people are very used to. Backing that up is this energy and biomass pyramid, showing you that from every transfer, every time one organism eats another, only 10% of the energy that's inherent in their food they're eating, could be plants or it could be prey, only 10% gets into the body of the one that's eating. Like a cow eating grass, only 10% of the biomass and the energy inherent in that grass gets incorporated into the cow's body. The rest is lost as waste and heat. So 90% of the energy in that grass is lost. 90% of the energy in a hamburger you eat does not become utilized by you. So it's a very energy inefficient transfer. So if we eat meat, we've lost almost all of the energy that was inherent in the grass that was eaten by the cows that produced that beef. But if we eat the plants, there's a much smaller amount of loss. It's more efficient. These are some general goals of an agricultural system that supports ecosystem strength and regenerativeness. Water storage in the soil and filtration, carbon capture and storage, biological diversity and biological functioning of the bacteria and the microbes in the soil, and productive capacity for the crop above. So it's a very supportive, healthy, strong system that inherently holds a lot of energy and capacity and ecological capital in the soil. Very different than our monoculture systems, which are pretty much inert. Minerals and dirt that we have to add water to, we have to add nutrients to, we have to add everything to it because it doesn't have a lot of capacity to hold on to and nourish plants of its own. And that's what we want to work back towards, are these healthier systems that can support plants and regenerate more self-sustaining. Here are 6 methods that can be used in regenerative agriculture that are soil building practices. Interplanting beans and legumes with other crops like corn, as you see in these pictures, that can really help. It adds diversity, and because it's a more diverse field, pests have a harder time completely obliterating it or infesting the whole field, so less pesticides have to be used. That's one example of how a polycultural system will help out and help reduce use of fossil fuels, energy, and toxic chemicals. Integrated pest management is a system of taking care of your agricultural system, but it's a management protocol for taking care of pests. So you're using a variety of non-toxic methods. If you have a pest, you develop some tolerance to the pest, meaning you might see some caterpillars on some of your crops and you think, okay, there's not really enough for me to do much about. They're causing some damage, but not that much. So you let them be. They could be food for birds. Only when they get to a certain level, then you start to take action. Okay, this is going to hurt my crops more than I want them to. and more than they're able to handle, so I will take a step to manage that pest. And the first methods you use are non-toxic, the least invasive, the least ecosystem toxic that you can find, and see how those do. And as you go on, if that solves it, great. If not, you can go up to the next more invasive or toxic level of pesticide or pest control method, and take it step by step. That's what it is. You can use almost any method in integrated pest management to control your pests, but you're always trying the least toxic, least ecologically invasive or damaging method first. And you might have a plan too. This is usually dovetailed with when you're talking about the possibility of humans interacting with that. Let's say it's a chemical pesticide, you would take that into account and use much less or none of those chemicals if they're going to be possibly come in contact with humans. And maybe you could use a little more if they're not going to ever. So, but this is a big change. The reason it's a cool thing is because, you know, even just like 50 years ago, if a farmer or a landscaper had a problem with a pest, they would take out the big guns right away. The first thing they would use would be something really toxic and try to annihilate that pest. So integrated pest management is more thoughtful. Let's stop, let's think, let's be tolerant of some pests, let's make sure we're using non-toxic methods wherever we can. And that's a big change. For example, the city of Santa Barbara has an integrated pest management policy now. It did not until 2006. And now the people that take care of the the parks, the athletic fields that are run by the city, now when there's a pest problem, those workers have to follow the policy of using only non-toxic chemicals, or at least thinking about the least toxic way they can take care of it. Again, 50, or actually not 50 years ago, but before 2006, the workers in the city would just they could just go get some glyphosate or maybe some atrazine to get rid of the weeds in a turf field, and those would cause lots of ecosystem and human health problems. Something similar to regenerative agriculture is called carbon farming. It's a name for agricultural methods aimed at sequestering, meaning gathering and storing, the carbon from the atmosphere into the soil and the crops and the organic matter in the soil. So that's again turning on its head the older, more historic approach to agriculture is do whatever we can to get the highest yields. It doesn't matter if we're depleting the soil. It doesn't matter if we're poisoning the ecosystems. We didn't know we were doing those things, but that was the only focus. Now it's like, oh, we have too much carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. We have unhealthy agricultural systems. Let's now focus on the plants being healthiest and living long and building big roots, and the soil having lots of organisms. That's going to pull out a lot of CO2 and store it in the organisms in the soil and in the plants. And so carbon farming is even more focused, just as much as it's focused on getting yields for food for humans, it's focused on taking carbon out of the atmosphere and storing it in plants, preferably perennial plants, because they live a lot longer and they hold on to the carbon longer. That's one method of helping climate change, is through carbon farming. And hopefully you've heard of things like community supported agriculture, where a group of people can buy into supporting a local farm and they receive kind of like a box of food, of produce, weekly or monthly. So everyone kind of owns that farm, and usually these are organic farms, more often using regenerative techniques. So you can support yourself, your own health, by getting this really good produce and well-produced produce, and support techniques that help the whole ecosystem of your local region, and actually of the world if you consider the atmosphere too.